Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we are here to talk about James Meredith and the civil rights protests at Ole Miss and their legacy, of course, on the civil rights movement. So let's get at it and begin. To talk about James Meredith and his role in history, we're going to have to go back a little bit in time. And in the 1950s, Southern leaders very much supported a system of segregation, and that's going to create kind of like a declared war in the United States, a cultural war. And they believed that Southern leaders wanted to keep segregation and whatnot. But then in 1954, they're going to have a big loss in this cultural war, and that's going to be the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education. And in that case, the Supreme Court's going to rule that segregation is not allowed in one context of life, and that would be schools. In that case, the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall proved that segregated schools had a negative impact on the psychology of African American children, and that's going to lead to them getting an inferior education. So that said, the schools were expected to desegregate and whatnot. Now, the federal government at this point was getting much stronger, was starting to tell the states, particularly the southern states, what to do about their schools and how they had to ban segregation. So that is important, Brown v. Board of Education. Now, the southern states got mad about Brown. They were like, no, this is a violation of our rights. States should determine for their schools. States get to determine whether they have segregation or not. It's up to the states, not to the federal government. It's called state rights, that they should have the power to decide this, not the Supreme Court, not the federal government. Now, what does states' rights mean? Well, to elaborate a little further, in 1776, Great Britain owned the colonies, the 13 colonies, right? And they violated the American rights. So in response, the American colonists had a Revolutionary War, and we kicked the British out of here. And the founding fathers then created a series of governments, but a government where they established the federal government, the powers of a federal government, a faraway government. And they said, all right, this is what we want the federal government to do, because this was the federal government that was replacing the British. But then to avoid that federal government from getting too powerful and from abusing the American people, just like the British had, they put in the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment specifically says that the powers that were not specifically already delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. The states get to decide. That way, that what they were trying to accomplish with the Constitution was, we're going to give power to the government, but they can't have anything else. The federal government can never grow again. Everything we don't list here belongs to the states. Well, either way, that's the 10th Amendment, the reserved clause. And the states then pointed out the federal government was, with Brown v. Board of Education, was trying to get a little powerful. That nowhere in the Constitution does it mention education or segregation, and therefore, according to the 10th Amendment, those decisions and power remain to the states. So back in 1954, when Brown came out, the states again said that the Constitution didn't mention schools of segregation, and instead that meant that power is reserved to the states. Sorry for repeating myself, and that the federal government needed to mind their own business. And however, the federal government in 1954 was not talking about the 10th Amendment. They were talking about the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment says that everybody needs to be treated equally before the law, and that includes African Americans, because this amendment was passed right after the Civil War. And no state shall deprive equal protection of the law. So you can't have one law for one group, one law for the other. And segregation kind of was fulfilling that. So now we kind of have a violation of the 10th Amendment versus a violation of the 14th Amendment. And what are the courts going to decide? Well, either way, with this, we're going to have to figure that out. But suddenly there's movement on this issue with Brown v. Board of Education. So there's conflict and tension rising, and the southern states think that they're right about the 10th Amendment, and the federal government thinks it's right about the 14th Amendment. So 1955, everybody's all upset, and there's going to be this battle of the Montgomery bus boycott, a battle over segregation of buses, and that's going to, of course, lead to Martin Luther King becoming famous. In 1957, there's going to be a battle over segregation in high schools with the Orville Favis and the Little Rock Nine. And 4 years later, we're going to have a new battle in 1961-62 with James Meredith. So what does James Meredith want? Well, James Meredith wants to go to college. And in Mississippi, there's no all-black colleges. And so therefore, the South can't make their claim that for the 14th Amendment is not being violated. I mean, if you were going to make a claim that the 14th Amendment wasn't being violated, you would say that, well, segregation is equal because there are white schools and black schools, and therefore black students can't go to the white schools because they have their own schools, but there were no black colleges in Mississippi. So this really basically said, I mean, it was good evidence that the South was wrong, that they were violating the 14th Amendment. So James Meredith wants to go to a previously all-white school called Ole Miss, a very prestigious place in Oxford, Mississippi. So what is the problem? Well, in 61, 62, he applies. He wants to go there. And ultimately, Mississippi says, no, we're not going to desegregate the school. No African Americans will go to Ole Miss. So, Brown v. Board of Education in theory doesn't apply, at least according to Mississippi. They said that it applies to elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, but not to colleges. Well, anyway, James Meredith is going to fight that decision. So who is James Meredith fighting? Well, James Meredith is fighting Ole Miss because they're the ones that won't let him in, even though he's applied. He's also fighting against Mississippi, who's the one saying, no, we're not going to allow any colleges to desegregate. It's against our law. So what starts this conflict? Well, James Meredith challenges segregation by applying to Ole Miss, and he puts the application in, and he gets rejected, even though he's a straight-A student and has been in the military, which should be good, and he gets rejected twice. Now, legally, this doesn't make sense because James Meredith has the A's and has a background in the Air Force. So lesser candidates actually were getting into Ole Miss, and the NAACP, when James Meredith starts to fight this, the NAACP helps him out, and they actually put in an identical application, only with a white name attached, and that white student got in. James Meredith did not. So James Meredith now basically has a lawsuit sponsored by the NAACP saying you are only discriminating against me. You're not letting me in because of my race, and that's a violation of the 14th Amendment. Well, in 1961, they are battling, right? Mississippi versus James Meredith. He's trying to get in. They're saying you're never going to get in, and so on. So Mississippi's like, no way. So finally, the Supreme Court decides on this issue, and they support Meredith. On September 13th, 1962, with the Supreme Court behind him, there's a court injunction to Ole Miss by a lower court, let him in. Ole Miss, you lost your court case. You have to let him in. An injunction is a court order telling somebody to do something under the pains of you could either get fined or imprisoned. So let him in. So this is victory for James Meredith. This should have been success. So it's time for him to register again. This is like the third, fourth, or fifth time he's trying. So he goes to enroll, and this time John F. Kennedy is president, and John F. Kennedy sends a member of the Justice Department to carry out the court's order and to get him registered, because they didn't want to send James Meredith by himself into this hostile environment. So now he's got a Justice Department member that is armed and ready to go. So the Justice Department member is going to ensure that he gets registered. He's got a gun. He's got a court order. He's going to make it happen. So what happens? Well, a mob of protesters are there, and they're going to have to get through them, and they get through the mob. The mob does not turn violent. But there's an additional obstacle. As James Meredith tries to register, the governor of the state, a guy named Ross Barnett, says, I don't care about the federal courts or that injunction. Mississippi will never be desegregated. You're violating our 10th Amendment rights. So let's get to know Barnett a little bit. So the governor of Mississippi said, no school will be integrated in Mississippi while I am your governor. So he's living up to that promise. He also said the good Lord was originally a segregationist. He put the black man in Africa. So that was his argument that, biblically speaking, segregation is okay. Mississippi has the largest percentage of African Americans, Black Americans, because they love our way of life here. And that way is segregation. He's like, well, they would have left. But of course, many of them didn't have the economic means to leave. So on September 20th, 1962, here's Kennedy and the Justice Department guy helping Meredith register. And there's Ross Barnett, who's rejected Meredith already a bunch of times. But this time, Ross Barnett actually drove down to Oxford onto the campus, and he goes into the registrar's office, and he's standing in the doorway. So the Justice Department guy and Meredith can't physically get past him. He gives a speech. He says, I took an oath, and I'm upholding the Constitution. I won't let you in here. So no school for James Meredith. He is rejected yet again. And the 14th Amendment is ignored and not carried out. So what will John F. Kennedy do now that the governor of a state is violating a Supreme Court order, a court injunction, and the 14th Amendment? So what will he do? Now, President Eisenhower, when Orville Faubus in 1957 did this at Little Rock High School, he brought out the military, the army. What's Kennedy going to do? Now, if you remember that, the Little Rock Nine was pretty crazy. Now, is Kennedy as strong as Eisenhower? Is his will as strong? And I'm going to say that probably not, because in 1960, Kennedy barely won his presidential election. And he only won, if you notice, because the South is all blue there. They voted Democratic. If he forces them to end segregation, he's going to lose the South, and he won't get elected in 1964. So he doesn't want to use troops. He figures that will anger the South. Instead, Kennedy uses a much more passive-aggressive method, and he's going to call Ross Barnett on the phone. So they have a bunch of verbal arguments. Kennedy's like, "You have to let him in," and Ross Barnett's like, "I know, I won't, I won't, I won't, I won't." So anyway, Ross Barnett says, "Listen, my people are in mob form. They're angry. They're mad, and if you send him down here, there's going to be violence. Why don't we just wait a little while? There'll be a cooling off period till everybody goes back to work, forgets about this, and gets a little less mad." And again, Ross Barnett says, if you send him down here, there's going to be bloodshed. People are going to die. These are both very rational arguments. And that's what Ross Barnett says to Kennedy. Don't let him in. Now, of course, Ross Barnett's being disingenuous because he supports segregation. He doesn't want to let Meredith in. He's just saying whatever he can to get Kennedy not to force him in. But anyway, that conversation goes nowhere. So there's no agreement to register Meredith. But Ross Barnett convinces Kennedy maybe a cooling off period would be smart. Let's wait a minute. So Kennedy goes back to the courts, and a few weeks later, on September 28th, 1962, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which originally gave the injunction to the governor to let him in, says, "Governor, if you don't let him in, I'm going to fine you personally $10,000 per day, and I'm going to lock you up in prison." And that is enough to get the governor of Mississippi be like, "All right, I'm not going to stand in the way of this anymore." So governor says fine to Kennedy. He says, "Listen, just I need to pretend at least that I'm standing up for my people in segregation. Just help me save face, will you? I'll keep battling away while you force your way in here. I can't agree to let him register, but you force him in and I won't stand in your way." So on September 28th, 1962, Kennedy forces him in. He says, "I'm going to register James Meredith. This is like our second attempt or fifth attempt, whatever." So the attempt number 2, on September 30th, 1962, Meredith is flown down to Mississippi's campus, escorted onto campus, and by 500 cops, U.S. Marshals. These are the people that work for the courts to go hunt down criminals. And now they're going to escort him on campus. Now, Kennedy likes U.S. Marshals because they wear ties and suits. They don't wear uniforms. And they're not the army with heavy artillery and so on. He figured that could escalate the situation and anger the people of Mississippi. These guys look a lot more like regular human beings and therefore might be able to, anger unless they want to escalate the situation again. So there they are, the U.S. Marshals, 500 of them, and there they are on campus. You can see them in the background, and they're protecting Meredith so that he can register. So there he is. They're on campus, and again, there's the member of the Justice Department again. So how does Mississippi respond? Well, I can say the way one person in Mississippi responds, and that would be retired General Edwin Walker. This guy's going to become famous later, involving Lee Harvey Oswald and the assassination of Kennedy. But at this time, it's before that. So Edwin Walker is somewhat retired, and he's down there, and he goes to a radio station and announces through the radio, "Our way of life is getting destroyed. We need 10,000 people from everywhere, all over the South, to go to Ole Miss and rally to the cause of freedom, and don't let Meredith in there. So don't let those evil Democrats tell us what to do." So either way, angry students gather. 10,000 they come from all over the South and all over the state of Mississippi. And of course, from that college campus, they gather to stop Meredith. Angry outsiders gather on campus, over 3,000 protesters, and that night, the campus turns into a riot. Bricks are thrown, gunshots, Molotov cocktails are made so they can be explosives. Basically, when they hear that James Meredith has registered, that he's on campus, 500 marshals get attacked, and 5 cars get blown up, and then here they are, the students attacking the marshals and tipping over cars. It's awful. And also those outsiders, right? At 11 p.m., Ross Barnett goes on the radio, and of course he's going to announce, "Please, I'm against violence. Don't calm down. I know that you don't like James Meredith, but just stop being violent." He actually doesn't do that. He doesn't de-escalate. He goes on, "We will never surrender. This attack by the federal government and Kennedy on our way of life must not go unanswered." So he basically riles up the crowd, and the riot goes on. A crowd even attempts to grab a bulldozer and go over the marshals. Attempted murder. So in the middle of the riot, Kennedy decides, you know what, the marshals aren't getting it done. Their lives are at risk. So he actually, like Eisenhower at Little Rock, sends in the U.S. Army, 25,000 heavily armed troops. These are the troops that defeated Hitler, are now invading Mississippi and invading Oxford's campus, Ole Miss. Now, eventually, the protest is shut down. The night goes on. The army comes in. The riot lasts 15 hours. 166 marshals were injured. 40 soldiers from the army were injured. 4 marshals were shot. 2 civilians were killed. So what happened? Following morning, it did take an army, literally. James Meredith registers for class. Here he is right now with the register, signing up for history class. And again, took an army, took 500 marshals. Now, it's going to be 4 challenging years for Meredith. He's going to stay on campus for 4 years and eventually graduate, but he does graduate. And a big part of the time there, he's brought with protection, right? But so why is this all important? Well, number one, he's the first African American student admitted to Ole Miss. That is a huge moment in history, and that's going to matter. Number two, the message was sent that in all colleges, if you don't let African Americans in, then we are going to send the military in, and you will get invaded. So schools start relenting and letting African Americans in. James Meredith had to be that first person, but he got it done. So the South was going to be forced to listen, where the federal government is forcing African American students in. Number three, John F. Kennedy basically, and this is a good example from his presidency, basically sent a message that from now on, you mess with civil rights on college campuses, we will send in the army. We're 30,000 troops. This is the largest use of force by the U.S. government on U.S. soil ever. So Kennedy, of course, you got to applaud him. I mean, he's alienating the South. The South is what got him elected. So, I mean, this is a huge political sacrifice for him to do what he thought was right. Number four, another legacy. Could Kennedy have avoided the riots? Some people say you got 2 people killed, hundreds of people hurt in the army, in the federal government. Maybe you could have de-escalated. Maybe you could have avoided the riot rather than sending in all these troops to escalate. Maybe you could have negotiated. So was one student worth this much money, millions of money, people dying? I mean, that was a very expensive move. People died, people got hurt. Kennedy escalated this. Should he have de-escalated, found a way to get people to be okay with it? Maybe a longer cooling off period. I don't know, but Kennedy escalated and that created some issues. Another legacy, number 5, this inspired hope. This was a battle that African Americans won, and it was a battle. And when you win a battle, the success begets more success. People are then willing, they're inspired, and they're willing to fight. And millions of African Americans in the South are going to fight after this because they thought they could now win. It wasn't just that they would fight and lose, they could win. It raised confidence and inspired millions, and it's going to lead to future action. And there's going to be a lot of future actions that we're going to get to until segregation is banned completely in 1964 by the Civil Rights Act. And that is the story of James Meredith and Ole Miss. Thank you for listening, and there'll be future civil rights presentations also on YouTube as well. Thank you.